Okay, hello everyone. My name is Jeff Wasielewski. I'm a commercial tropical fruit extension agent. We're also joined by Dr. Jonathan Crane, the tropical fruit specialist. And today we're going to have a new growers workshop on avocado. Just a few housekeeping rules. You will be on mute throughout, and you will be able to ask questions at the end in the chat. We will have the Q&A at the end after a brief 2 to 3 minute survey. I'm going to be putting into the chat a couple times 7 different publications. One of them is on pesticides. That one you can't get anywhere else. Pesticides for avocado. The rest of them you can get on Ask IFAS. If you go to Ask IFAS, type in avocado, you'll be able to get them all, but I'm going to give them to you as PDFs. So if you can't get them now, you can get them through Ask IFAS. So that being said, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Crane.
Hey, thanks, Jeff. And thank you for joining us today. And let me just go, we're going to talk about the basics of commercial avocado production. And most of what we're going to talk about today is what you would need to know no matter where you are in Florida to grow avocados. And so we know that there's a lot of interest in expanding the avocado production throughout Florida. There's already been some expansion, and so we're hoping to assist new growers and any people that are thinking about growing avocados. And certainly if you have questions and concerns that you think of later on, you can contact Jeff or I as well. So let me get started. Let me see if I can move this forward. Okay, and so this is just an outline of what we're going to talk about. I won't read that. So what are some of the opportunities? So as I think everybody is aware, the consumption of avocados, and I'm talking about all avocados in the US, has been increasing dramatically for many years now. And it seems that it's continuing to increase. So there's a lot of interest and a lot of consumption of avocados. So potentially we could help address that. And we'll talk a little bit more about the differences in avocados and the potential different markets for those as well. Again, so this is looking at the avocado production by state. And you can see California has probably 90% of the volume that's being produced in the US. Florida, it's about 10%. And then Hawaii, a much smaller percent. But Florida has a significant industry and a very unique industry in the U.S. And then if you look at the U.S. Census of Ag and you look at the acreage in Miami-Dade County, you can see since 2002 it has been declining, and this is due primarily to a fungal pathogen that is transmitted by a number of ambrosia beetles. There has also been some development as well that has resulted in a loss of production. And then if you look at the acres, that center graph, and the orange line is the total acres, which is, similar to the other graph, but it's just a line. But the number of counties in Florida that now indicate that they have some commercial avocado, and that could be from 1 acre to even over perhaps 100 acres, you can see we're up to about 25 counties that are indicating that they have some avocado acreage. So there are small plantings throughout the state of Florida. This is looking at Florida avocado production by county, and this is excluding Miami-Dade, which has certainly 85, 90% of the, actually 90% of the acreage. But you can see Polk County has quite a bit, and it's by year. So the colors correspond to the number of acres that have been put in over these years. And you can see Polk County, Palm Beach County, and Lee County, and Brevard County stand out. And as I mentioned before, many other counties have very small acreages of avocado. This is just to show you, we're going to talk a lot more about this because really one of the most important thing about potentially expanding production and growing avocados in Florida and expanding the acreage northward has to do with the climate. And in particular, the number one concern, of course, is temperatures and freezing temperatures. And what I'm depicting there is the plant hardiness zone map from 1990 and the one from 2023. And the zones have changed. We are now in a warmer zone. Most of the state has changed zones to a warmer profile. And we'll talk more about this. So in the past, and I'm talking about the recent, 30, 40 years, this is where you found the commercial avocado production. And as I mentioned, in the recent, 20, 30 years, it's been primarily Miami-Dade County, certainly over 95%. And then small little plantings in these little coastal areas. And I'm sure there's been some other very small plantings, but really in the past. And the reason for that, of course, is freezing temperatures. And people from Floridians from the mid 1800s onward have tried to grow avocados from, let's say, Polk County south. And for the most part, these plantings have been killed by freezing temperatures over the years. We all now know that, the climate and the temperatures are changing. And so, is there a potential for a change in where the location of avocados is being produced? And as I mentioned before, I showed you all those counties, and you see that there is production, beginning or a little bit reemerging or surviving in Central Florida. So what has changed? Again, opportunities and risks. So, overall, we're all aware that the average temperature, air temperatures have increased. And really, if you look at the data carefully, it's the nights. We have warmer now. On average, we have warmer nights than we have had historically. So this may allow for production of some cultivars in the more central Florida and northern parts of Florida. And it's also showing, changing the number of growing degree days. In other words, the temperatures that allow the plant to thrive and produce fruit. Now, the change in location throughout the state, this may affect the time from flowering to harvest. And we see this in other production areas in California. So depending on where you're located in California will depend on when your trees flower, when your trees fruit. So the same thing in Florida. So we may see shifts in the flowering and harvest periods. In contrast to that, we may see a decreased potential in some parts of Florida to induce dormancy during the winter. In other words, you want your trees to stop growing after harvest, during the winter, and usually October, November, December, somewhere in there, of course, depending on the variety, because the tree needs time to, number one, produce carbohydrates that it stores in the stems and the shoots. That is that, and then those buds, those axillary and terminal buds, will switch over from being vegetative buds to reproductive, or let's say flowering buds, and that needs a period of dormancy or not growing. It's technically called quiescence. It's an environmentally induced stopping of the growth or dormancy. It may also affect the post-harvest handling and the storage characteristics, because the environmental conditions affect the physiology of not just the plant, but the fruit itself. And also, there is a potential for increased pest pressure. So if it's staying warmer longer, pests can thrive for a longer period of time. So as I mentioned, there's also a potential for increased hot days, and what I mean by that are days that are excessively hot, which can cause some damage to the plants, and also perhaps increase the amount of sunburn damage to the fruit, especially the fruit that's held on the outside of the canopy. Also, I mentioned previously, increased disease susceptibility, because again, it's warmer longer. And so, we may find in the future in some parts of Florida, we may need to add some additional horticultural practices to mitigate high temperatures. things like whitewash and things like that to try to protect the fruit from sunburn damage. So also, there's also data to show that there's been a reduced number of freeze events in Central Florida. So if you look at the data back 30 years at a particular site in Central Florida, historically, in the past 30 years, there may have been somewhere between 8 and 9 freeze events per year. If you look at that same site over the past 20 years, it may be 5 or 6. If you look at that same site over the past 10 years, it may be 2 or 3. And if you look at the predictive models for the future, it may be 1 or 2 or less. So, this may provide this reduction in plant damage from these repeated freeze events. I do want to caution people, though, that it really only takes one freeze event to kill trees, and especially young trees. So, all things being equal, young trees are less cold hardy. In other words, can withstand less freezing temperatures, less repeated freezing temperatures than mature trees. So, even though things in general have gotten warmer, you still need to be prepared. You still need to pick a very good site to plant your trees, a site that hopefully has no or minimum freeze potential, right? So we also may see an increase in precipitation in some areas. And, if it's well distributed, this could reduce the potential for drought conditions, which could help reduce irrigation costs since you're getting rain-fed irrigation. There is, in contrast, in some areas, a potential for more frequent soil saturation and or flooding. So in areas, flatwoods areas, places like that, that are susceptible to excessively wet conditions or flooding conditions, if we're having more rainfall events, especially significant rainfall events, that could be a problem. It could also mean greater flooding depths, right? So it is in especially in areas that have that potential for wet conditions, it's going to increase the need for flood mitigation practices. That's going to be really important that when you look at a site for avocados, it's got to be well drained and it's got to have the infrastructure to drain that water off so that these trees are not in saturated or continually saturated soils or flooded soils. Avocados do not withstand constant saturated soils or flooding. About 48 hours of flooding and the trees are going to start to die. And we'll talk more about that later. So also there's, a potential, especially along the coasts, naturally, for increased sea level rise. And so this can pose some problems, especially in coastal areas. So you could end up with, the aquifer being contaminated. Um, you could have storm surge, and you can contaminate the soil with saline conditions. So it reduces, the arable land, the land that's useful. Mitigation practices with salinity, generally involve using non-saline water to flush the salts below the root zone. And that can work to an extent, but if your water source becomes contaminated, also saline, that's not really going to work because you're just using saline water to push more saline water below the root zone. So salinity is a huge, huge problem. And this is something you really need to pay attention to is, are the wells or are the water source that you're going to use for irrigation, is it good quality water? Because saline water is really not usable. Avocados do not do well in areas that have consistently contaminated soils with salinity or with saline water for irrigation. So this is just a chart showing you some of the environmental parameters we know for avocados. And these are all documented. I'm not showing you the documentation behind it. In the handout that Jeff is going to offer you guys, I do have the citations of where we got this information. And so you'll see there are three ecotypes or three different, some people call them races, I call them ecotypes of avocados. There's West Indian, Guatemalan, and Mexican. And they have optimum temperature ranges for growth and production. They also have different freeze damage of mature tree temperatures. So these are for mature trees, and you can see the Mexican ecotype can withstand colder temperatures than the West Indian types, right? And then there's a general temperature for when heat damage begins to become a problem, and then some comments on that side. However, you'll note that most in Florida, we're growing West Indian and Guatemalan hybrids, or Guatemalan West Indian hybrids. And so things change, the parameters change a little bit. Same thing with the Guatemalan and Mexican hybrids. So it's a mixed story. So it really depends on the variety or the cultivar that you're growing, because they have different ecotype background, genetic backgrounds, and their behavior varies among the cultivars. This is a little bit more, and this has to do with their flood tolerance, their salinity tolerance, their drought tolerance. And then again, on the right side, I've got some comments. And you can see they're all sensitive to intolerant of flooding, right? Um, and salinity, again, they say the West Indian, or they say the research has shown that the West Indian cultivars or rootstocks are more tolerant to salinity than the Mexican types, and this is true. But again, if you're consistently having problems with salinity, it's still probably not going to go well. And then they all are moderately drought tolerant. However, drought does not help with fruit production for quality fruit. So you'd want an irrigation system. Okay. And so anyway, so some of the risks, and this is I hesitate on this part of the workshop. I don't want this to be a doom and gloom scenario, but I think it's really important that we talk about the risks so that people can make sound decisions on where they're going to, whether, number one, are they going to plant avocados? Number two, what cultivars, what is the infrastructure they need to be successful? And so they go in with as much information as possible. It really behooves people to really locate the best possible site, grove site or orchard site possible, to reduce the potential for environmental damage as much as possible. So freeze events can be a major concern. And as I mentioned previously, in parts of Florida, especially low-lying areas, flatwoods areas that have potential for wet conditions, you really do need to have that infrastructure, whether that's beds, contour, drainage ditches, whether you need a pump to move water off or on to the ditches. Um, you really need to have that in place before you start planting trees. And as I mentioned, we have a lack of Phytophthora root rot resistant rootstocks in Florida right now. There are some that are available. They are clonal rootstocks, which are being produced for avocado trees in California. However, they are very, very expensive, and they may or may not be producing the varieties or the scions that you want to grow. So this is something that we need to work on here in Florida, is to hopefully have and figure out the procedures and a cost-effective procedures for producing clonal rootstocks that have resistance to Phytophthora root rot, which is a major problem when you have wet soil conditions. Of course, hurricanes, and that's all over the state. Really, the main mitigation practice for that is going to be controlling the size of these trees. If you have trees that we found after a Category 5 storm, if you have trees that are much above 15 feet, they're more likely to be pushed over or pulled out of the ground than if they are lower to have a lower profile. Laurel wilt, this is something that is a major issue in the Miami-Dade County production area. And we have lost probably 40% of the commercial acreage. It's a little complicated because of some of the development that's going on, but probably over 350,000 trees to this pathogen, which is transmitted by ambrosia beetle vectors. Um, we do have some experience with some mitigation practices. There are a few practices such as increasing the light and the wind movement in groves through annual pruning practices, which help to tamp down the beetle activity. But the beetle, it is an ongoing issue right now and an ongoing research project for us. Um, Outside of Miami-Dade County, there's really not much experience with mitigating the laurel wilt issue. Again, I think outside of Miami-Dade County, people need to be aware of their surroundings, what is in the natural area. The ambrosia beetles will transmit this pathogen to native trees in the Lauraceae. And so you need to be aware, are there native Lauraceae in your area? Is there laurel wilt activity in the natural areas? Because it is in the natural areas and in some urban areas. Um, in general, younger trees, I'm talking about trees that are below, let's say, we're not exactly sure, but I would venture to say somewhere below 15 years are less susceptible, less likely to be attacked by the ambrosia beetles. But certainly older trees are more susceptible. So this is something people need to think about as we move forward in the future. And we are continuing to work on mitigation practices, both active and passive. As I mentioned, pruning practices are a key component of reducing the beetle activity in your orchard or your grove. So those are things that can be done. Also, something that needs to be thought about as well is we have competition. So we have major avocado producers. Mexico is the largest producer in the world, and primarily exporting Hass to the U.S., which is a different market than the more tropical avocados that traditionally have been grown in South Florida. However, the Dominican Republic grows the same type of tropical avocados that we grow in South Florida. They are also growing Hass as well. So there is competition out there. So you need to think about, how are you, where are you going to market this? How much of a demand is there for the fruit? And how do you move forward on that? And we're not going to go into detail on the economics. There are some papers that have been written on that Ask IFAS. If you go up and you type in avocados and economics, you'll hit those papers. They're being updated as I speak on the costs of production and also about the industries as well. So I would encourage you to look at those and to investigate, how are you, what is the market and how are you going to address that market? Uh, so next, I think, is Jeff takes over.
Yes, thank you, Jonathan. And everybody, as soon as Jonathan takes over again, I'm going to start dropping those publications in the chat. So be on the lookout for those. So I'm going to talk about,
Jeff? Yeah.
what's that?
A recording?
Yes, sir.
Okay, thank you.
So I'm going to talk about avocado botany. And avocados are in the Lauraceae, which Jonathan mentioned. And important crops are avocado. And then you also have cinnamon and camphor. The origin is Central America, Mexico, and Northern South America. So you can see that kind of fits in with us. So that's why they're so easy to grow here. Center of diversification is believed to be the highland, subtropical, and tropical areas of Mexico and parts of Central America. Evolution. It began as a rainforest understory tree, if you can believe that. Now it's a much bigger tree, as we'll hear. And then Jonathan mentioned the ecotypes. So you don't get ecotypes with many tropical fruit, but avocados, you definitely have the Mexican, the Guatemalan, and the West Indian, and they do cross. So they're the ecotypes, and they evolved in several rainforest environments. They have a shallow root system. So think about South Florida. What happens when you dig down 4 inches? You get rock. So that shallow root system kind of works out here. Um, and the shoot growth is synchronized into major flushes. So you might have noticed sometimes your avocado will just, or your avocados will just flush out all at once, new leaves. Um, and then we're going to put M for Mexican, G for Guatemalan, and WI for West Indian. So here's some areas where they're grown. Dominican Republic, you can see very contoured. Chile as well. And then you have Florida, marine subtropical, much flatter. California, you see the trees are sort of more columnar. They're more up and down. They're tighter, and they're also on like hills and mountains. So makes it a little more difficult to harvest. So they're grown in tropical, subtropical, and cool subtropical areas, depending on the ecotype. And you can see some of the areas there, and you can see they're not just green. So look how big the trees can get, 30 to 65 feet. So Jonathan mentioned when you have that hurricane, if you have something over 15, it's not going to do that well. So imagine you have a 50-foot tree and it's 50 foot tall and it's 40 feet wide. When you get that hurricane, that wind shear is going to catch that tree and just push it over or snap it. So pruning is the way to go. Again, shallow root system, mostly evergreen, and dropping leaves is influenced by genetics, climate, disease pressure, and flowering. And we often see going into the dry season, sort of in the middle, the trees will drop all their leaves, and then right after that, they'll flower. And speaking of flowers, they're pseudo-terminal flower. So it looks like it's coming out of the middle, the terminal area, but it's not. It's coming a little bit out of the side. So here's what they look like. Indeterminate and determinate flowering. You can see the new growth is already happening there on the left picture. And on the right, you have new growth and flowers. Because remember, they drop all their leaves and then the flowers come, and then the new growth comes after that. So here's the sequence, flowering to fruit, from top left around to bottom left. So you see the flowers come out a little ball, then they open up. They open up again. By this point, some of them have probably been pollinated. Then if you look at that fourth picture on the bottom right, you see some new leaves start to come. You look at the fifth picture in the bottom middle, you see the new leaves. And then by the time it has fruit, the fruit are kind of tucked in there and they're hard to see because there's already new leaves. So the fruit, if you can believe it, is a berry with a thick, leathery to thin, papery exocarp. Fruit can be different shapes, pyriform or globose, which is like pear shape or round. Oil content of the pulp is 10 to 30% for Mexican and Guatemalan, 3 to 15. So depending on how much fat you want, you can go, Mexican, Guatemalan, or West Indian, how healthy you want to be. So the ecotypes, general characteristics, we looked at some of these earlier, and here's the origin of each: tropical lowlands for West Indian, tropical highlands for Guatemalan, tropical highlands for Mexican. So these highlands, you're going to have cooler temperatures because you're up a little higher. No odor, and then you have anise scented, so you can maybe break the leaves and smell them and get be able to tell that it's a Mexican. Blooming season, you see they vary, and then the maturity season varies as well. So if you want to have some earlier avocados and then some later avocados, you can mix it up with the West Indian, Guatemalan, and those hybrids in South Florida. So more characteristics, how long it takes to set the fruit size. See the Mexican small, we think about the Haas. We know that's small. Woody rough for Guatemalan for skin texture, papery smooth for Mexican, and leathery smooth for West Indian. And then again, the fruit oil content, which is what we just talked about, is higher for the Guatemalan and Mexican. Oh, and I think I'm going to pass the baton at this point,
Okay. Thank you, Jeff.
and I'm going to put those publications in the chat at this point. Sorry, John.
No, that's great. Thank you. So I want to talk a little bit about, in more detail, about some of the environmental parameters. So again, you see the listing there of the optimum temperatures and the freezing temperatures and the heat temperatures. So these are things you need to think about when you're trying to select cultivars to grow. Okay. And so you can use this table later. Let me see if I can move this. Okay, so cold hardiness. So again, when you look at young trees rather than the mature trees, you can see again the Mexican ecotypes as young trees are more cold hardy than the West Indian. And it's just to show you this. Now, of course, there's exceptions when you look at the hybrids, right? But this is if you're looking at the pure races of these, okay? So again, some optimum temperatures for the different types of growth. So root growth, shoot growth, for photosynthesis or carbon assimilation, people call it, somewhere between 68 and 86 is ideal for avocados in general, and also for pollinization and fertilization of the flowers to produce fruit. Once you start going below those or above those temperatures, then it can affect the fruit set and the pollination. So the optimum is that floral induction would occur during the fall and winter, as I mentioned, when the tree is not growing. And this is following the summer vegetative growth. So you're harvesting, you're going to have a vegetative growth. And then during that fall period, the tree is accumulating carbohydrates through photosynthesis or carbon assimilation, which are then used later when the tree flowers and sets fruit. Okay. And this, I'm talking a little bit about floral initiation. The Guatemalan and the Mexican type cultivars will require some cooler temperatures to stimulate this change of vegetative to reproductive buds. The West Indian has a higher low temperature at which this can occur, right? And then the normal optimum temperatures for flowering during normal flowering behavior, which we'll talk a little bit more about, somewhere between 77 degrees in the day and 68 degrees at night. That's sort of the scenario, right? Another thing too is that the fruit of the Mexican ecotypes, the Guatemalan and Mexican cultivars like Haas is generally smaller when they're grown in warmer climates compared to cooler climates. So that's something to keep in mind. So as an example, Haas, the size of Haas in Florida tends to be smaller fruit than it is in a subtropical or Mediterranean type climate. And that can be an issue if fruit size is an issue. So if some people don't want to buy smaller fruit, and you're trying to grow a fruit that ends up being smaller in a warmer climate, then that's a problem. So you have to think about that. So we've talked about this a little bit. So these are the environmental hazards that you really need to consider, whether you have a planting now or if you're thinking of putting in a planting. A little bit about freeze events. So, is freezing weather on the way? And I think everybody is familiar with the scenario that we can get these cold air masses, and especially if the jet stream dips, and if we have a low pressure system to our east, it can allow this cold weather, cold temperatures to hit Florida. And, is freezing weather on the way? These are just some rules of thumb and what to watch out for. Usually these cold fronts take, 2 to 4 days to reach Florida. But you want to be watching the weather during the winter carefully. Are there record low temperatures in the Midwestern states? Are the winds at the surface blowing from the north, northwest to the south, southeast? Of course, if we're predicted to be the target of a cold pressure system. When we have freezing temperatures, I would say it's normally we experience 2 nights. Usually the first night is an advective freeze. We'll talk a little bit more about that. That's called a windy freeze. And the second night is a radiation freeze. And those are the nights where it's dead still and completely clear out, right? And actually, both types of freezes can occur on the same night. Usually, you start out in the evening with the windy freeze or the advective freeze, and then by late or early morning the next day, you'll end up with a radiation freeze. Advective freezes, as I said, is when these large cold air masses of freezing temperatures are windy and move into the area. There is no inversion layer, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. And with the windy freeze, the heat from all exposed objects is constantly removed by the wind. Very difficult. This is a much more difficult freeze to protect from than a radiation freeze. So here's this advective freeze, and you can see the wind is just, moving any heat from any surface. It's just being blown away. Radiation freezes. So this is when you have a cold, clear, still air. And in some cases, you can actually have the cold air somewhere, between 30 and 50 feet. And there's actually a warm air mass or warmer air above that. And so by mixing these layers, this is one of the strategies, by mixing these layers of the cold and the warm air, you raise that temperature in near the surface and protect the trees. So some of the factors that affect the cold or freezing tolerance, of course, is the genetic makeup of the trees. Also the size, and we've mentioned this, older trees are more tolerant to cold than young trees. Also, healthy trees are more resilient, not only to the cold, but in recovering from the cold. Trees that have been under previous stress, environmental stress, are more susceptible to damage than trees that have not been. Also, trees with a heavy crop or directly after a heavy crop are more susceptible to damage than trees that were harvested, prior to the freeze event. This may be unavoidable in some cases. And also trees that are diseased or have insect damage are more susceptible to damage. This here, I'm going to show this several times, but this is cold hardy selections of avocado. There's been interest in cold hardy varieties in Florida for a very long time, Texas and California as well. And this is just a listing of some of the varieties that have been reported and documented to withstand some freezing temperatures. And here you see cultivars which withstood about 9 hours at about 26 to 27 degrees. And you see a listing there of the different varieties. And in parentheses is their genetic makeup, M for Mexican, WI for West Indian, and G for Guatemalan, right? And then there's cultivars that withstood 2 nights of temperatures from 25 to 32. And then others rated as tolerant to 25 degrees. We also are fortunate. We have a plant breeder located in Gainesville, Dr. Shapiro, and he has been working on developing and selected cold hardy varieties. So, in the future, hopefully we will have some superior cold hardy varieties, which will greatly help the Florida industry. So the effect of the freeze event depends also on the depth of the freezing temperature. So just how cold does it get? How long do the freezing temperatures last? How many times does it freeze that year? So do you have, 4 nights or 3 different events separated by some amount of time? And again, the tree health and also what stage of growth of the trees. So, trees that are dormant or not growing and that have not been growing are going to be more cold hardy than trees that are about to flower or trees that are flowering, right? And then these are the typical symptoms of freezing stress. I think many of you are familiar with those. You see the water soaking of the leaves, things like that. There's different methods of cold protection. There's these passive methods, which really include site selection, which is super important. Clean culture, we'll talk a little bit more about that. The pre-cold irrigation, soil banks, tree wraps, and tree covers. And then there are some active methods for cold protection. So site selection, elevated or passive cold protection. So this is obviously not Florida. This is actually in Chile, um, where locating the trees and orienting the rows has become really important. So, usually we think of on hilly sides or hillsides of putting the trees, running along the hillside. In this case, running the trees up and down the hillside, they find that the cold air drains off of the site much better than if they have the trees oriented in the other direction. So there's also the lake effect, and this has been used in Florida for a long time, where you put your planting site on the south or southeast side of large bodies of water. And the idea is that these cold temperatures coming from the northwest have to go over the lake, and you have this lake effect. The lake water has a high capacity to hold heat. And so as that cold air moves over the lake, it changes the temperature, it warms it to some extent. So by the time it hits your avocado planting, it's actually a little bit warmer than it would be if it was on the north side of the lake. So, of course, sites near the coast and generally are warmer. I already mentioned south or southeast sides near large bodies of water are warmer. Um, Also, you want to keep in mind that the southeast side of windbreaks may be colder than the windward side, right? Because you're stopping that cold air drainage, right? And of course, low-lying areas, as I showed you those pictures in Chile, are colder than higher elevations. So preparing for it, for a freeze, one one method that's been used a long time is clean culture. Um, and so what the idea of that is that you remove the vegetative growth between the rows, and you have the soil is moist, and this allows the sun, the solar heat, to penetrate to the soil surface and warm that water that is in the soil. And so, and you have to do this, prior to a freeze event, quite a ways ahead of a freeze event. It should not be the day before or even a couple of days before. It's got to be before that. And the idea is that you're warming up that soil profile, and then during the cold weather, that heat that is stored in that water in the soil profile is re-radiated back up into the trees to help protect them. It doesn't work in Miami-Dade County because our soil is basically a rock, and the pore spaces are so high that it doesn't really retain any heat. So the other is a pre-freeze irrigation. And so I already mentioned, water has a high capacity to store heat. And so you're looking at, several days, 3, 4, 5 days before a predicted freeze event. You want to, irrigate the entire grove and then allow the sunlight to, hopefully the sun will come in and warm up that soil and the soil profile. And again, um, during the freeze event, the heat that is stored in that water will re-radiate it back up into the trees and help protect the grove site, right? But irrigating during the daytime prior to the night of a predicted freeze is really not recommended, is really not going to work. Why? As I mentioned before, it's usually windy the day or so before a freeze event and it's blowing the heat away. So if you're applying water during that time, you're sort of evaporatively cooling prior to a freezing event. So it's got to be done ahead of time. So one thing for young trees, and I already mentioned this, you can have a cold hardy variety, but remember, young trees are much more susceptible to freezing events than mature trees. Something that's been used in the citrus industry for a long time is soil banks. And soil banks are effective for young trees. The idea is to mound the soil up and cover the graft union part of the tree at least. And this will protect it. So even if the top is killed, the tree can resprout, the scion can resprout and regrow the tree. The thing about it of the soil banks is you've got to put the soil around the base of the tree, and you can't leave it there forever. You need to take it down, otherwise you're going to have trunk rot. Another method is using these trunk wraps. And basically what they do is they delay the heat loss from around the trunk. And generally they're used in conjunction with an irrigation system. And they need to be constructed of a material that has a high insulation value. And they need to be inspected and possibly removed after the winter. Why? Because sometimes ants and other insects will set up house inside, and they can actually damage the bark of the tree. So here's just to show you an example. These are both citrus trees, one with a soil bank and one with tree wrap. This is, again, citrus with the tree wraps. Now you'll see the citrus tree, there's different types of tree wraps, as I mentioned. The sapodilla tree on the right is wrapped actually with batting material, insulation material that's used for like up in the attic. And it was wrapped around the trunk of the tree. And the irrigation system was put on a small stake and placed up into the canopy of these young trees. And here's just showing you the batting material that was cut and used to make the tree wrap, and there it is around the tree. And here's the micro irrigation system with a 360-degree micro irrigation placed in the canopy. And they did successfully protect these trees during this one freezing event. Other types include these plastic covers. They're really expensive and time consuming, not likely to be used. Also, orchard fuel heaters historically in the distant past were used, but they have environmental problems, a lot of maintenance. You have to refuel them, and they're expensive. And you have to have about 36 to 40 of them per acre to be effective. I already mentioned this. This is mixing the air layers with a wind machine or a helicopter. And this is actually taken, the wind machine is in a grove in Central Florida, an avocado grove, has some citrus as well. And then the helicopter, but trying to use a helicopter, it does work. You can mix those layers of air, but it's something you need to arrange way ahead of time. You're not going to be, most likely, you're not going to be successful calling somebody the helicopter service the day before and asking for them to fly over your grove. So wind machines can be expensive. As I mentioned, the helicopters is an option, but an expensive one. So there are some systems using water, mist systems, flood irrigation, and then irrigation systems. And I have a handout, a fact sheet that talks about the different types of irrigation systems for tropical fruit production. This is the link to it here, and I think Jeff is posting it as well. And so, how does cold protection work? Just briefly. So, the heat of the water when it comes out of the ground, usually down here, it's at about 65 degrees when it comes out of the ground. It cools off when it hits the tree and goes down to 32. That gives off a very small amount of water. Really, where you get your heat for protecting the tree is what's called the heat of solidification or the heat of fusion. And this is when water changes from a liquid to a solid. It gives off a lot of heat. And so the theory goes, if sufficient water is continually applied to a plant, and that plant can withstand 31 to 32 degrees, the heat given off as the water changes from liquid to solid maintains that plant at about 31, 32 degrees. It entombs the plant in ice, and the plant lives. And so you have to have a, and avocados this does work for avocados. But there's three major components. Plant number one has to be able to survive 31, 32, okay. And you must put out sufficient water per acre per hour, and it must be continually supplied or applied to the plant surfaces throughout the freezing period. And it needs to completely cover the entire plant, or as much of the plant as possible. Otherwise, you get evaporative cooling, and you actually, the parts that are getting evaporatively cooled go below freezing, and it causes more damage. So you have to have a good irrigation system. It needs to be sufficient to put out sufficient water, and it needs to be managed properly. Mist or fogging systems, we don't recommend. I've seen a system, it was used actually in a mango planting, and during the cold, the mist system, two problems. One is the mist was blown away out of the grove, so it didn't stay in the grove, so this fogging system did not work. The other is that if it becomes clogged, then it's not working, and you're getting evaporative cooling or worse, right? So they're not effective under windy conditions, so I wouldn't recommend a mist or fog system. Flood irrigation is a potential, especially in those areas, flatwoods areas, but you need to have sufficiently high beds, and you need to be able to move the water into the ditches between the beds quickly prior to the freeze event, and you need to move it off really quickly after the freeze event. Why? Because of the flood potential, the potential for root rot. So it's something that, you really need to have the infrastructure and make sure that it's working to be effective. Micro sprinklers, and there's basically two types of micro sprinklers. There's some that can put out, 10, 20 gallons per sprinkler per hour, and there's others that can go up to maybe 40 gallons. And so all things being equal, the more water you can put out per unit time, the better the cold protection. So anyway, so there's, you need to have the proper pumping. You need to have the sprinklers set up correctly. And I know some people have groves where they have micro sprinklers, and they could even be high volume micro sprinklers, let's say 40 gallons per sprinkler per hour. But the issue becomes, can they run all the sprinklers in the grove at the same time? If they have it zoned and they can only run, let's say 5 acres at a time, it's not going to work to put 5 acres on for a half an hour and then switch to another 5 acres and then switch to another 5 acres. Once you turn that irrigation on for cold protection for that grove, it has to stay on the entire time. If you turn it off, you're going to get evaporative cooling, and those trees are going to go below zero and really kill the trees. So you've got to have the pumping capacity to do everything, or you need to decide, hey, I have 5 blocks. I'm only going to protect block 1 and 2. So you need to plan for this, right? And again, placement of the sprinkler, whether it's going to be a 90-degree head on it, placed on the north or northwest side of the tree from the ground facing upward towards the canopy, or is it going to be put on a little post inside the tree canopy with a 360-degree sprinkler? Anyway, so I've talked about this ground-based versus in the tree, 2 or 3 feet up. I showed you a picture. So, the advantages of the micro sprinklers, in general, you're using lower volumes of water and things like that. Some of the potential dangers, especially if it's a windy freeze, is you can get a lot of wind distortion. And so you have to really think about managing the system properly. If it's windy, so if it's, above 5 miles an hour, 10 miles an hour, you don't want to turn the system on. But if all of a sudden the wind dies down, it becomes clear and dead still, now you want to turn that system on. So there's some art to managing the system properly and timing when you turn the system on and use the system. This is showing you that sapodilla tree during the freezing event. And then over here, this is the ground-based. This is on lychee trees here. And we've placed the sprinkler on a 90-degree head pointed up into the bottom of the canopy. And of course, here's citrus, where it was successfully used to protect the bottom of these trees from freezing. Flood events. So this is something, as I've already talked about somewhat, about you really need to prevent saturated soil conditions and flooding events. Phytophthora root rot is a fungus that lives under low and thrives under low oxygen conditions, not necessarily no oxygen, but low oxygen conditions.
Jonathan,
Yes,
this might be me this section.
I'm sorry.
I
Thank
should
you.
let you go.
Yeah, no,
Take a
no.
break.
Oh, my goodness.
Okay,
You
so
go ahead.
as Jonathan was saying, if I talk for a root rot, it's kind of everywhere. And when you get the trees and the roots wet, it can show itself when you get that soil saturated. So flood tolerance, we want to have our trees tolerant of floods. So you have the genetics that can help. Rootstocks, we're going to see a couple times here. They're not readily available in Florida. They are in California. Jonathan and I have been out there. We've seen how they do it. Super cool. But like Jonathan said, very expensive and even more expensive to get them here. And those rootstocks would be more resistant to Phytophthora. So what about healthy trees doing better? That's pretty much across the board for many things. You want to keep your trees healthy, good fertilizer schedule, good pruning schedule, proper irrigation schedule. So no matter what comes around, you're going to be in better shape. Trees with a heavy crop or directly after a heavy crop, when they're kind of worn out, they're more susceptible to flood damage, which makes sense. Disease or insect damaged trees are more susceptible. So that all makes sense. The effect of flooding events depends also on the drainage characteristics of the soil. South Florida, we have a big benefit. We have that limestone rock. You pour water on that, it goes right down through that. We have some areas of marl where it's going to pool up a little, where it's a little bit lower, just a foot or so lower. But mostly we have the limestone, the oolitic limestone. Also, it depends on the duration of the flooding, how long, and the frequency. How many times? Do we get 3 big rains within 2 weeks or just one? The tree health, like we mentioned, tree growth stage. Is it putting out new leaves? Is it not? Is it full of fruit? Is it just fruited and you picked everything, so it's really worn out? So symptoms, what are you going to see? Leaf wilting, chlorosis, desiccation, abscission, stem and limb dieback, fruit desiccation and drop, and tree death. So these are kind of things you don't want to see on your tree. So how do we mitigate floods? How do we do better when we're thinking we're in a flooded area? Well, we want to plant only in well-drained soils. So for South Florida, it's very important when you go to buy your grove that you check what is the elevation. Just a foot or two, which you won't see with your eye, but just a foot or two can change the soil that's below the ground. So you're going to have that nice oolitic limestone that drains very well, where you're going to do much better in a flood, or you're going to have that clay, the marl, it's like clay, which what we're looking here at the second line, check for hard pans and rip open the hard pan. So you don't want to have that. And one way you can do it is just dig a hole. If you dig down and get rock, you're probably better. If you dig down and you kind of get a gray clay after you go through a little rock, you don't want to buy there. When you establish the grove, let's say you already have your grove and you do have some marl, you're a little lower, or you're further north, you have an area where you're a little lower, you need to make beds. You need to make beds for the trees. You need to make them high. You need to make a little wide. You need to make them sloped. So when the water hits them, they go off the bed. Don't put little holes, little divots close to the tree. You can try ditches and canals. We've seen some of that. You can contour the land for drainage so it kind of drains off. You can use tiles, which they do sometimes, under driveways and things to let the water go through. And you want to have adequate pumping capacity to move water off the planting. That's if you have these ditches and canals, you have the pumps to move everything out. And then again, you want to plant with Phytophthora root rot resistant rootstocks. Ooh, say that 4 times quick. That's tough. And again, not readily available in Florida at this time. So unfortunately, we are doing some testing with some of them over at the research center. So that's pretty cool. Remove 25 to 50% of the canopy immediately after flooding event. So if you get a big flooding event, go in there and prune because the roots are not going to be working as well. So we want to cut down those leaves so we're not losing so much water out of the leaves. And there are chemical controls that you can do if you get saturated soil, phosphoric acids, phosphonates, and mefenoxam. Let's say I got that right. So here's the raised beds. You see that on the left. You see how it's contoured down. It's not flat at the top. There's not little divots near the trunk. And you're going to have most roots above the saturated soil. Remember, we talked earlier, avocados have most of their roots in that first foot. They don't go down that much, so they don't have a lot of taproot action. So this bed would work very well. Needs to be high enough to avoid the flooding, and it needs to be properly designed to move water out of the planting. That's stuck. There we go. So that's flooding. And with hurricanes, you can get flooding and tropical storms. But let's talk specifically about hurricanes because Florida is in the zone. So Jonathan mentioned this earlier about the Category 5 storm, and that was Hurricane Andrew, came in 1992. Seems like a long time ago, and it is. But those of us that were here, we distinctly remember it. And Jonathan and I think Carlos Belardi and Richard Campbell did some studies after the storm. They went out, looked at the trees, and you see the trees on the top that were pruned. For the most part, they survived much, much better. The ones that were not pruned, remember how big avocados can get? They didn't do so well. So tree size, it's very important to prune. If you listened earlier, we talked about laurel wilt. Jonathan talked about laurel wilt, and that if you get light and wind in the grove, you have less chance of getting the beetles that bring the fungus that kill the trees. So we want to prune our trees for that reason. We want to prune them for hurricane damage. We want to prune them for many other reasons. They're easier to pick, they're easier to spray, and you want to do the pruning once a year or every other year. You don't want to let it go 4 or 5 years because then by the time you prune that tree, you're going to cut off so much of the tree that it's going to put all its energy into leaves and it's not going to want to flower fruit for another 1 to 2 years. So it's a big waste. So your tree should be no higher than 2/3 the distance between your 2 rows. So you have the rows, 2/3 of that, you don't want the tree higher than that. So if we have 20 feet between rows, you want the tree at 13 to 14 feet. That's going to let the light to hit every part of the tree. 22 feet, 14 to 16, 25, 16 to 18. The important thing to remember is between rows, the height of the tree, 2/3 of that distance. So that's hurricanes and flood. What about salt damage? This is what it looks like. And this is salt damage on Merritt Island. And when you get towards the coastal areas, even if you're not right there, your pump could be pulling up salty water. So even though you're not getting the salt spray or you're not right there and your roots are not in the water, your pump could still be pulling up salt water. Here it is in Chile. So symptoms, as we saw in those pictures, marginal and tip necrosis on leaves, stem and limb dieback, reduced fruit size, fruit drop, tree death. How do we fix it? How do we do better? Site selection, water quality and quantity. These things are easier said than done, because if you're in an area that's getting slowly inundated by salt, then it's very difficult. Flushing the soil profile periodically, so you're getting fresh water and just sending that through the ground to clean everything up. And then tolerant rootstocks. So mitigation, again, site selection is best. We've heard that a couple times. Site selection is super important with everything you're going to do. So if you're a new grower and you're thinking about growing, spend a good amount of time looking at the areas you're going to go to. Don't just look at the price. Use of tolerant rootstocks, and like we said, a periodic flushing of the root zone to move salts below the root profile. Drought stress. Here's what they look like when they're drought stressed. You guys know this. This is also kind of like the first stage of laurel wilt. It will kind of look like this as well. So symptoms, the classic leaf wilting, fluorosis, desiccation, abscission, fruit drop, reduced fruit size, stem and limb dieback, reduced crop yields, tree death. So very similar to some of the other things we looked at. But you can, if there's a ton of water getting in there, it's not drought stress. And if it hasn't rained for a long, long time, then we can lean towards drought stress. So how do you fix it? Irrigation system appropriate for your soil type. Manage irrigation frequency and duration. Important periods for irrigation. When do you do it? At flowering and fruit set. So when you see those flowers, you start thinking about irrigation. During fruit development, when you get that fruit set and it's getting a little bigger, we want to slowly pump up that fruit with some irrigation. And then prolonged drought periods. We're kind of in one of those right now, but we're also flowering. So now is a really important time to be irrigating your avocados. And remember, the avocados like a little drought stress going into the winter. They like to settle down and calm down. So you don't want to give them a lot of nitrogen. You don't want to give them a lot of water. But then once they flower, that's when you start thinking about watering, because the fact that they slow down, they're getting ready to bloom. They're waiting for that signal. So going to pass this over to Dr. Crane, selected avocado cultivars. I'm going to drop those publications in the chat again for you guys.
All right. Thank you, Jeff. Yeah, thanks. So I just want to I'm going to talk briefly about selected avocado cultivars. There you see Choquette and Lamb Haas, which is a Haas-like avocado, which was selected in California. And we've been testing this actually over the past 3-4 years. Anyway, So let me see if I can get this to move forward. So some of the considerations is the climatic adaptability of the variety that you want to grow. So as an example, historically, when people have tried to grow Hass in Miami-Dade County, it has not worked out well because the trees, even though they grow, their production is low, but also the fruit size is extremely low, and the fruit quality is not very good. Now, that's not necessarily true in parts of Central Florida, but I'm just giving you an example. Also, the marketability, does anybody want to buy that variety that you're going to grow? And then there are some differences in disease and insect management. And then also you need to consider the type of rootstock that you're going to use. So adaptability, cold hardiness, heat tolerance, effect of the high temperatures on fruit quality, disease tolerance, susceptibility, rootstocks, and of course the grove layout with respect to the varieties. We'll talk a little bit more about that, how that can be important because pollination is an important component of successful avocado production. Some varieties are more self-fruitful than others, and so it can in many cases, we recommend planting more than one cultivar, but they have to be complementary cultivars, and we'll talk more about that. And then, of course, the marketability. Does anybody want to buy that variety? So again, here's those cold hardy selections I spoke about. You can review those at your leisure. And so here's marketability examples for smaller fruits, right? So, many or most of the markets desire these smaller fruit with a high oil content and a nutty flavor. And there are some cold hardiness considerations. So Hass is the #1 cultivar grown in the US and consumed in the US, right? The main suppliers are all these different countries, including Mexico. And the second most popular cultivar, although it's on a very small scale, is Lamb Hass. This tends to have a larger fruit size and the quality is good. Gem is another minor one, and Gwen is another minor one. Others, Reed is also grown in Florida and California. It's larger than Hass. It's good quality. You have, Booth 7, Brooks Late. These are grown, on a very small scale. Edinger is not really grown here, but it has been grown historically in California and other places. Day is a very minor variety, and Pinkerton, again, another very minor variety. So these are some things to look at and consider. So I'm going to go through this quickly. You can go back and look at this at your leisure. As Jeff may have mentioned previously, we are recording this presentation, so you will have access to it in the future. So this is Hass, and I'm just giving you some of the background, and that includes the parentage all the way to fruit shape, the average fruit weight, and some issues and comments, right? Here's Lamb Hass, and this is one we've been testing here actually in Miami-Dade County, and it looks like it's a pretty good cultivar if you're looking to grow something Hass-like. How it does in Central Florida, there's been some planting of it. I'm not really as familiar with it down here. So far, it looks pretty good. Again, there needs to be more work with it, especially the post-harvest handling of the fruit. Gem is another one that comes from California and is considered an alternative to Hass. Gwen, another one as well. And you'll notice on some of these that I put in there the blossom type, whether it's an A-type tree or a B-type, and we'll talk about that when it comes to talking about pollination and fruit production. Here's Gwen. Here's Reed. This is being grown on a small scale, not only here, but in California as well. This is one that's not being grown in California. This is Booth 7, and there's a series of Booth. This is Booth 7. It's a B type, and you can see it quite different characteristic peel difference between that and the bumpy peel, dark peel of, let's say, Reed or Hass or Lamb Hass. Brooks Late, this is a Guatemalan West Indian hybrid. Has a lot of Guatemalan characteristics. Very large seed though. Edinger, um, again, large seed. Um, one of the drawbacks is the short on-tree life, so it needs to be picked when it needs to be picked. Fruit cracking can be an issue. So you'll see these comments on each one of these as we go through this. Day, generally larger than Haas. There's not much really. There's a lot of anecdotal information, anecdotal information out there about Day, but there's not a lot of hard data on its performance, especially for commercial production. Pinkerton is another one. This is an old time variety that has been grown commercially on a small scale. And you can see it has quite a different shape than many of the others. Brogdon, this is one that's in Florida, has this dark purple color. This may, have it be an obstacle to some marketing. People might think it's not, they might think it's rotted or rotting or too far gone. So some of these may, require a different tact in marketing the fruit. So marketing examples for the larger fruit with good quality. And again, cold hardiness is a consideration. These are sometimes called tropical avocados or green-skinned avocados. I prefer the name tropical avocados. And you'll see Booth 8, Choquette, Hall, Lula, Monroe, Tonnage. Oro Negro and Brogdon, they're really not being grown commercially, but I'm just bringing those up because there could potentially be a market or create a market. And here's Booth 8. And you'll notice the ruler there says 15 centimeters, that's 6 inches, okay? And you'll see some of the issues. It can overbear, small fruit size, moderately susceptible to scab, which can be a problem in Florida. Here's Choquette. This is a large fruit, excellent quality, productive. This is one that's being grown commercially. It's a good quality fruit. Hall, this is another one, some susceptibility to Cercospora spot and scab, also being grown commercially. Lula, major issue, highly susceptible to scab. Good quality fruit. The problem is getting fruit that is not covered with scab. It's highly susceptible. It is being grown, but it's one that has to be sprayed to prevent the scab from just ruining the crop. It is a vigorous tree as well. Monroe is another high quality Guatemalan West Indian hybrid. This is a good fruit. It's a large fruit, but and good fruit. Tonnage is another one that's considered pretty good fruit, and it's moderately susceptible to scab. Oro Negro, this is one that's more, I should say, not really being grown commercially. There's very little documentation on it. I have seen some overbearing on the trees in some years. It has this dark green to dark purple color, so that might make things a little bit hard for people to tell, when is this fruit ready. Rootstocks. So characteristics with the rootstocks have a big effect. They can affect how vigorous the tree is, how good the fruit production is, can have a dramatic effect. In general, rootstocks in avocado can have a profound effect on not only the yield, but also the vigor of the tree and even on the quality of the fruit. Can affect anthracnose resistance, nutrient uptake, phytophthora root rot tolerance, and salinity tolerance. The thing of it is in Florida is that mostly people have used Walden and Lula fruit as a source of seeds for rootstocks. We have really not gotten into clonal rootstocks, which are genetically identical rootstocks. that are available in some other countries, but also in California. And these rootstocks have been developed to be moderately too tolerant to Phytophthora root rot. The trees are expensive to produce because it takes longer. They're basically double grafted. And really, I'm not aware of any nursery in Florida that's begun to produce clonal rootstocks for avocados. It's something that could be, there are some alternative methods that should be tested to see if there's not a quicker or perhaps much less expensive way to produce clonal avocado rootstocks in Florida that would be economical for the producers to either make themselves or to purchase, because shipping the trees from California is very, very expensive. It just adds to the cost of not only them being double grafted, but makes them really expensive. So this is the effects. And I'm just showing you the production area here and the types of rootstocks. This is just a sampling. There's many, many more rootstocks. I'm just showing you some of the rootstocks that have been produced in these different production areas. And they can have a profound effect on the fruit quality. This is something we need to, and the fruit production, we need to look into more closely for Florida, especially if we're going to be expanding or even replanting groves here in Miami-Dade, but also expanding if the industry is going to expand. So basics of infrastructure.
That's me, Jonathan.
This is you, Jeff. You go.
Thank you. So grove infrastructure basics. So we talked about picking out your land, where you're going to get it, and now we're going to prepare it to plant. We're going to prepare it. We're going to clear, level, or slope if we need to, make bedding or ditches if we need to, based on the elevation and based on the soil. And a lot of times you just have a bunch of weedy trees and things like that, and the best way to go is just get a bulldozer and push it all out. So the grove layout, you want it north to south. That's preferred because that's going to give you the best light exposure. And sometimes you need to change it up to get equipment and movement or equipment and move things. So you might want to change it, but north to south is the way to go. We see a lot of that here. Your irrigation system for watering and possibly fertilizing, fertigation, you could do micro sprinkler or drip. And if you're going to do cold protection, you're going to need some high volume. And Jonathan mentioned you're going to need a pump that gets everything all at once. You can't just do half of your grove and then switch it to the other half, because when you switch it, that first half is going to die because it's going to be frozen. So wind machines, cold protection, Jonathan talked about that. That's something you could do, but it's not that feasible. It's very expensive. Site selection, plant only in well-drained soils. So I mentioned that earlier. Check for hard pans. If you do have something that's, you get down there and it's very clay and very firm, then you want to get a backhoe and just rip that open. And again, avoid low-lying areas. So this is really something you want to do your homework before you buy your land. And if you do get somewhere that's a little lower, do the beds. You could do ditches, canals, contouring. These are all things I mentioned earlier. And try to plant with Phytophthora root rot resistant rootstocks. I just say it again, not readily available in Florida at this time. And remove 25 to 50% of the tree canopy after a flooding event. Mentioned that earlier. Mentioned the chemical control earlier. But really, what you want to think about is looking at that land ahead of time, checking the soil. Very, very important. The soil is key. Spacing. Once you get your area, once you get it all cleared, now you're going to do your planting. So life expectancy of the grove, you want to think of that for spacing. If you think the grove is only going to last 25 years, then you can plant a little tighter. You want to think about the climate. If it's a lot warmer, you're going to need to plant a little further apart. Tree vigor varies among cultivars and rootstock combinations. So you need to try to figure that out because that again will go with your planting distance. Then think about the ultimate tree size desired or required to maintain fruit production. You're going to be pruning, so you know that, so you can keep it at a certain height. Presence of an irrigation system, that also will affect your spacing, and equipment availability. So what about Florida? Range is 15 to 25 feet in row. That's the long row of trees. So 15 to 25 feet. So you might want to drop right in the middle there, 20, unless you're really going to do a lot of pruning. You don't want to keep them at 15. That could be difficult. And then between the rows, where you're going to drive your tractor and things like that, you go further, 18 to 30. Because remember, in there, you're going to have to drive your sprayer and things like that, and your pickers and all that, your cherry pickers. So 20 to 25 feet recommended in the row, 22 to 25 feet recommended between rows. Other industries, similar. So think about mangoes. For the most part, they grow about the same size as an avocado. And then you could try high density, 8 to 20 feet apart. And this is something you see it's more done in cool climates and plant growth regulators, which we can't use in the US. And then if you're going to be doing intensive hand pruning, you can tighten it up.
Thank you, Jeff.
Oh, I'm trying to go forward.
Okay.
I'm not sure if that's my last one or not. It
Yeah,
is. Look at that. You did
yeah.
it.
For once, I was on time. Um, okay, we're going to talk a little bit about flowering and why. It's because flowering there's two types of avocado trees, A type and B type, and that has to do with their flowering behavior. And in many cases, cross-pollination has been shown to be beneficial for avocado production. So if you look at avocado varieties, there's a range, a bell-shaped curve. Some avocado varieties can self-pollinate successfully and carry, commercial-sized crops. Others require cross-pollination, otherwise they're not going to bear much fruit. So in most cases, we are recommending that people plant at least two different varieties that are complementary. One tree is an A type variety and one is a B type variety. This way their flowering complements each other and they increase the percent fruit set and yield. And the other thing too is that in general, the research has shown that fruit that is the result of cross-pollination tends to stay on the tree. In other words, stay set on the tree much better than fruit that is a result of self-pollination, right? So if you have 100 fruit on the tree, and 50 of them were from self-pollination and 50 of the fruit were from cross-pollination, when you go to harvest, you'll probably still have the 50 fruit from the cross-pollination, but you may only have 30 fruit from the self-pollination left. So that's the idea, right? So let's talk a little bit more about pollination. Okay. So we're going to look a little bit at the flower morphology, their behavior, and the tree flowering types, and the flowering periods and cross-pollination. It's a little complicated, but we'll just talk a little bit about it. So the basic theme is that individual flowers on an avocado inflorescence open twice over a 2-day period. They first open in the females and behave as a female. The female parts are functioning when they first open. They then close, and the next time they open, it's the male parts that are working. Okay. And fortunately, avocado varieties or seedlings, but avocado varieties, cultivars, have a consistent pattern. So if it's an A-type avocado, that's the way their flowers always behave. If it's a B-type, that's the way they behave, right? The other thing too is avocados are primarily insect pollinated. There actually is an avocado bee. We don't have it here in the States. It is in Mexico, but primarily it's the honeybees that are doing the pollination here in the US. Another thing to think about is, sometimes cool temperatures can result in some of a change in when the flowers open and behave as male and female. But we won't have to worry about that right now, right? And so, like I said, cool temperatures can sort of mess up this A, B, and synchrony of the flowers opening, but there's nothing we can do about that. There's little evidence that, there's been a lot of debate about whether avocados are wind pollinated. It's controversial. There's more evidence that they're insect pollinated than wind pollinated. So here's an avocado flower that has opened for the first time, and it's in the female stage. And you'll notice the anthers, which are these green structures here, are laying flat along the tepals or the petals. And the stigma, here's the stigma, the style, and here's the ovary of the female part. And so this flower is in the female stage. And you'll notice not all the flowers are open at one time, but all the flowers that are open on this tree are in the female stage at this point. They then close, this flower will close, and the next time it opens, you'll now notice these anthers are standing vertically, and they are dehissing the pollen. So they're in the male stage, and the female parts are really not functioning anymore. So it's behaving as a male flower. So how do you get A and B trees? So in an A tree, this is hours here, military time. So 6 a.m., 12, 6 p.m., right? And here's day 1, and here's day 2, and here's tree 1, and here's tree 2. And tree 1 happens to be an A tree, and tree 2 happens to be a B tree. So when this A tree, the flowers first open in the morning, they're in the female stage. That flower then closes and stays closed through the afternoon and the night. And the next morning, it's still closed. After lunch, it opens again, and it's in the male stage. It's behaving as a male. The B-type tree, the flower opens as a female in the afternoon. And the very next morning, that flower opens again, and it's behaving as a male. So you might say, how do these two cross-pollinate if this is the pattern? And let me show you here. So this is the sequence of timing for A and B flower types under field conditions. So here's the flower type A. So you'll have a tree, the A type, it's in the female stage, and you have a B tree that's nearby, and it has flowers of the male stage, so they can cross. In the afternoon, this A tree is in the male stage, and the B tree is in the female stage. So that's how you're getting this cross-pollination. Okay. And here it is again. So here I've got flower 1 in the female stage, flower 1 in the male stage, right? Here's flower 3 in the female stage, same flower in the male stage. And then here's the bee down here, right? So you can see how they can cross. And so let me just move this. Yeah. So you can see how they can complement and cross. So you're getting cross-pollination between the A and the B flowers, the trees. I want to give you some examples of A and B type cultivars because this becomes important when you are selecting avocado varieties. If you're going to have A and B type trees in the grove or the orchard. And so these are A type varieties and these are B type. Okay, so as an example. Here's some more. Here's examples from Florida. So here's A types here. Here's some B types. I'm sorry, I repeated Brogdon again, but anyway, these are B types. The other important thing is that there's an overlap between the flowering periods of the different varieties. So if you have an A and B type trees, but they don't flower at the same time, it's not going to cross-pollinate. So they have to have some period of time during the month that they're months or so that they're flowering, that those trees are both flowering, right? So there are three main groups. There's early flowering, or trees that have early flowering, mid-season flowering, and late periods of flowering. So here's a good overlap. Here's an A tree, and here's the B tree, and their flowering periods overlap during this period. So potential for cross-pollination. And here's a tree where a variety is A, and it flowers during this period and doesn't flower during this B type period. So there's no potential for cross-pollination. So in any event, there are some varieties that appear to set well without cross-pollination. I mentioned this before. And so that's a listing of some of the varieties that are known. Whereas others like Pollock and Booth 8, they need to be cross-pollinated to do better. Okay. So, you know, as I mentioned, there's variability in the different varieties and how well they can sell for cross-pollinating. So improving pollination. So something that can be done to help enhance the natural pollinators. And that includes honeybees, but also other flying insects, which can enhance pollination. One is to do less mowing and allow quote unquote weeds or native plants to proliferate leading up to the period of flowering and fruit set, which also would mean, less herbicide use. And of course, not applying insecticides during the flowering period, which may kill the pollinators. So you might, in some cases, have an adjacent habitat for native pollinators where you allow the native herbaceous plants to grow and proliferate because that'll be a habitat for native pollinators. And you can also bring in honeybees. It's a very common practice to bring in beehives during the flowering period. Okay. So the requirements for optimum flowering and fruiting, and let me just check. Yeah. Is exposure to cool, non-freezing temperatures during the fall and winter. I'm talking about November, December, January. And dry weather conditions. This all enhances that the trees, quote unquote, go dormant or quiescent. And then as we get into late winter, early spring, then you have some warming temperatures and the trees initiate flowering. And it's really important to have to be irrigating the trees regularly, and that doesn't mean necessarily every day. It doesn't mean every day, but having an irrigation program during flowering and fruit set. Why? If the trees are under drought stress during flowering and fruit set, they are going to drop more flowers and fruit or setting fruit than if it was irrigated. Also, high temperatures during fruit development is good for fruit development. And again, non-limiting soil moisture. So in other words, having an irrigation program so those so those fruit and the trees don't go under drought stress because they will drop fruit. Okay. Another important thing is that after harvest, and avocado trees generally will flush somewhere around 2 to 4 times in Florida. That's natural. Even with the fruit on the tree, that's not a problem. And so what I'm talking about is after harvest, you may get 1 or 2 flushes of growth, and that's fine. You've harvested, you've pruned, you get several flushes of growth, and then during that late summer and fall, the tree is photosynthesizing and accumulating carbohydrates in the stems, which will be used later in the spring when the tree flowers, and that will assist in setting fruit, flowering and setting fruit. Okay, so really important to try to retain the leaves during that late fall and winter up to near flowering period. As you may or may not know, avocados generally lose their leaves during the flowering period. That's natural and not anything to worry about. But up until that period, you want the tree to retain its leaves. Jeff is up next, I think.
Yes, and don't forget, guys, I'm going to speak one more time, and then Jonathan's going to speak after me. Then we're going to do a very short 2 to 3 minute survey, and then we'll have our Q&As. I had a few Q's in the chat that I couldn't answer, so I'll pass those over to Jonathan when we get to that. So I'm going to talk about nutrient and fertilizer management. What strategies are we going to use? We're going to time the nitrogen fertilizer to support flowering and fruit development and post-bloom vegetative flush. So we want to build up those carbohydrates, we want to build up that energy, but we do not want to over-apply nitrogen because that will favor vegetative growth over reproductive growth. I talk about this all the time. You have your 3 numbers on your fertilizer, NPK. You want that first number to be lower than the last number. The last number, the K, that's flowering and fruiting. So they want nitrogen, but they don't want a ton of nitrogen. So keep it lower, keep that first number lower. And then all the other nutrients, I think there's 16 essential nutrients. We want to keep those at non-limiting levels. So we don't want to have our trees without iron or without boron or without zinc, because if you have just one of those too low, that's going to limit your tree. Soil moisture, we want that non-limiting, so we want it there. Like I said, we're going to keep it a little drier going into the dry season, but then once we get those flowers and the young fruit, then we're going to start slowly pumping them up. Appropriate tree size program. So I talked about pruning. We want to keep those trees, so we open them up to light and air, keep them easier to pick. And then we want to maintain the post-harvest canopy. So after you pick, you don't want to take too much of that canopy away. We never want to take more than 30% when we're pruning. Okay, soil fertility, to put it lightly, it's moderate, but I would say it's not much at all, especially down here with our limestone. Leaf litter or mulching is beneficial. Remember, these trees are going to drop a whole lot of leaves once they are getting ready to put out their blooms. So we can use those leaves around the tree to feed that back into the tree. Here's our levels for nitrogen per acre, and we're going to split those applications into 2 to 4 per year, prior or at bloom, mid-season, or just after harvest. And we don't want to put nitrogen in the fall and the winter. That's when we want the trees, remember, to slow down and kind of just relax before they get the signal to flower. Secondary and minor elements, those are things like zinc, boron, and iron. They should be applied on an as-needed basis or maintenance level to maintain tree health. So if you have a tree and you did some leaf analysis and you see it's really low with minors, then you want to do that maybe once a month. But if the trees look green and they look healthy, you can maybe do that once a year. Speaking of leaf analysis, these are the levels that you want. And this kind of information is very difficult to find. You have it here. Again, this will be on YouTube pretty quickly. So you'll have it there, but so you don't have to scroll through everything. I have this information. You can email me and I can send it to you. So what we're looking at is, let's say you do a leaf analysis of your grove. You get some leaves and you look at the nutrients in them. You want them to fall in these ranges. So nitrogen, you want it like a nice 1.8 or 1.9, et cetera, et cetera. And then in California, you're going to have these different numbers. But we're lucky to have these Florida numbers. This information is hard to find. And I'm going to get Jonathan to put it all together. Going to do it. So pruning, I love pruning. So tree size control, it maintains light exposure and fruit production along the sides of the tree. Like I said earlier, makes spraying trees much more efficient, gives you better quality fruit, harvest more efficient, reduces potential for tropical storm or hurricane damage. These are all things we mentioned before, and you see how important they are. So, to maintain crop production, the tree canopies must be exposed to full sun. So let's say you have a grove and you've let it go and everything is touching everything and the trees are all over each other. You're only going to get the fruit on the very top of that grove. So that's why you need to keep it pruned to let the light get in there. So, and you want to do that again annually or biannually, so once a year or every other year. And again, keep them 2/3 of the distance between tree rows. For example, 25 feet apart, they should be 17 feet. So again, once a year to every other year, 2/3 the distance between your rows. There's the math. You will get quizzed on this later. Now, look at this pruning technique here. This is basically how we do it down here in Miami-Dade. You have these monster machines, hedgers and toppers, and they just go right across the top of the rows and they top them and then they go on the side and they hedge them. When they hedge on the sides, they go at a little angle. So the top is further in than the bottom. So you're getting that sunlight all throughout. And this is a better bang for your buck than try to hand prune. So flowering and fruiting occurs in climates where vegetative growth ceases after summer. Vegetative flushing due to cool temperatures is beneficial, followed by moderately warm temperatures in spring during the flower period, followed by moderately high temperatures. That's what we have here in South Florida. Now, this chart, we talked about the website Ask IFAS. So that's a database of all the publications of University of Florida. And in there, you can type in mango, you can type in carambola, you can type in longan, sapodilla, in this case, avocado, and you're going to get a publication called Growing Avocado in the Home Landscape. In the back of that publication, you'll see a chart like this for all the different tropical fruit. So this chart is very important because it tells you when to do everything in what month. So we have January to December, disease control, insect, NPK, secondary minor nutrients. And if we look down at pruning, you see it says harvest period influences time of pruning. So we're going to want to prune after we pick, but there's many different times that the fruit are ready depending on the cultivar. So we can't just say the exact month. So diseases and insects, that is Dr. Crane. Take it away, sir.
Thank you, Jeff. Yeah, so just briefly, there's not a whole lot more to go, but major diseases and insects. And so you see there's quite an extensive list of potential diseases. Laurel wilt is probably the biggest problem because it kills trees, whereas these other diseases in general can be managed. And so, and on the insect side, the red bay ambrosia beetle, but also other ambrosia beetles are also an issue because they transmit the fungal pathogen that causes laurel wilt. There are some other insects that can be periodic problems, but it's only their control is only really on an as-needed basis. Okay, so let's just talk a little bit more about this. So laurel wilt and the ambrosia beetles, I'm showing you some of the symptoms there, the wilting, the sawdust tubes from the ambrosia beetles boring into the tree. If you remove the bark down to the xylem, you'll see the dark streaking. You'll see the leaves turn brown very quickly. In other words, that those limbs and shoots are dying so quickly they don't even upsize their leaves. That's how quickly they're dying from the pathogen. So the distribution of this laurel wilt ambrosia beetle complex, it is now in 12 states in the United States, from Florida up to up to North Carolina, all the way west now to Texas. And so this is just showing you where it's located and the intensity of it. And you can see Georgia and Florida, definitely. And this is both this is in the natural areas primarily, right? Is where the pathogen and the disease and the beetles, attack trees in the Lauraceae family. Avocados is in the Lauraceae, and so they have been killing native trees in both the natural landscape, but also native trees and avocado trees in urban landscapes. And so far as native trees, there's an estimate of over 500 million native trees have already been killed by this complex. So this is the distribution of this complex in counties being affected over time. And you can see it's really peaked out in these 2020, 2019. This is just showing you the distribution, the 12 states, 290 counties, and it's continuing to move north, northwest, and west. And you can see, it's continuing to move west into our north in the southeastern U.S. We also, since it moves through the natural areas, the beetles and the pathogen, we are pretty sure it is going to eventually make its way to California and perhaps also Mexico, Central and South America. So because it's moving through these natural areas. So one of the issues if you're planting avocados outside of Miami-Dade County is that what type of habitat surrounds your grove or potentially surrounds your grove? Is it citrus? Is it natural areas? Is it urban areas? Right? And can you identify the native Lauraceae that's in your area? And if you can identify them, and you should learn how to identify them, have they been attacked? Have they been killed? Has this complex has moved throughout all 67 counties in Florida. So it has sort of clear cut a lot of the native Lauraceae already. It doesn't mean it has removed all of it. So you do need to be aware if there are native Lauraceae still alive in your area. Why? You can use them as sentinel trees. In other words, if you start to see them die, you know there's an active outbreak of laurel wilt in your general area. And if you don't see that, then you may be okay, right? So generally, young trees, and I'm talking about trees that are probably less than 20 years old, are not usually attacked by these ambrosia beetles. And prior to the laurel wilt outbreak, which began down, well, this complex first entered Florida in 2005. So uh, prior to that, and prior to it showing up in the homestead, in the production area in 2011, 2012, we would see ambrosia beetle attacks on small stems and limbs in avocado trees. It was no big deal. It would kill a few, and that's it. The tree was fine. However, we do know from the research that any kind of environmental stress, whether that's freezing, drought, or flooding stress, tends to attract ambrosia beetles and attract them to attack the trees. So you really want to have healthy trees. And the other thing about it is that smaller diameter young trees in general are not suitable habitats for these beetles. What happens is these ambrosia beetles bore into a tree, form galleries, you might call them caves or galleries, and they reproduce inside these galleries. So they need a larger diameter piece of wood or trunk to do that than smaller trees. So they're more attracted to large, old, mature trees. And in the production area down here, until this outbreak occurred, I would say the average age of our avocado trees in the groves was somewhere between 30 and 40 years old. So these are big old trees, much more susceptible to attack by these ambrosia beetles than the younger trees. The other thing is, as trees begin to touch each other, their root systems begin to overlap in a grove, they will actually graft together. They'll bind together. And unfortunately, this pathogen can move from one tree to another tree through the root system. So again, this was an issue for us because almost all our trees, as I said, were 30, 40 years old. They are all root grafted to each other. So if one tree came down with a disease, it would quickly move from that tree through the root system to the adjacent trees. Okay. Young trees, though, are not root grafted together. And we don't know exactly when this occurs. It probably depends on how closely they are planted adjacent to each other. So the wider their spacing, the longer the time it takes for those roots to reach each other and potentially graft together. Um, so in general, that's not an issue for a long time. These are the pictures of the ambrosia beetles that have been contaminated with the laurel wilt pathogen, with this fungal pathogen. Excuse me. And actually, picture number one is the original beetle that introduced this pathogen into the US. The ones in red are ones that we are sure that are capable of passing the disease in addition to the original beetle. So these are the most important ones. This is just a picture of the fungus. It's Harringtonia lauricula. We don't have to go into details about it, but what happens is that when this pathogen is introduced into a tree, into the xylem, into the water conducting tissue, the tree reacts by trying to wall it off. It tries to wall the pathogen off. And it produces what we call tyloses, which are in the xylem, and it produces these to try to wall that pathogen off. The problem is when it's walling that pathogen off, it's also inhibiting or walling off the water conduction in the tree. And hence, that's why you see the tree wilt, because it's not conducting water. It's been blocked. We also think there's probably some, potentially it's being investigated, that there may be some toxic elements being produced as well, which further cause more damage. The other thing about this pathogen, this fungal pathogen, is it can move through the tree very quickly. So trees generally that get infected with this pathogen will die generally within 4 to 8 weeks. Sometimes they will resprout from the base or from the roots, but eventually they will succumb because the pathogen can live inside of the large roots and the trunk for at least a year. So it moves through the tree really quickly. This is one of the big issues with it. So this is just showing you what I described a little bit before. Is the ambrosia beetles fly to a tree. They'll bore through the bark to sort of like test this tree. If they're not sure it's a suitable tree to bore into to make galleries, because they're usually looking for trees that are stressed and which produce ethanol when they're stressed. They'll bore and do like a test bore into it. The problem is when they do that test boring, they're actually inoculating the tree with the pathogen. So that, several weeks later, the tree starts to stress out, and then that attracts more beetles. And so that's the problem, is that even that initial boring, even if they decide not to bore completely into the tree, once they inoculate the tree, it just takes longer, but eventually the tree starts to stress out. And then the picture I'm showing you up here is showing you here's a mature tree that's been infected, and the pathogen's moving to the adjacent healthy trees through the root grafts of the tree. And here it is actually in the field. So this tree came down with a beetle infested that tree, inoculated the tree with the pathogen, and it has moved through the root system to its neighbor right down the row. So yeah. Symptoms again, this is the wilting. You'll see fruit drop in occasionally, more wilting. The leaves usually die so quickly, they'll turn brown. They don't form an abscission zone and fall. They don't drop off. That's how quickly they're dying. Here's some fruit. It's a little bit hard to see, but it's actually shriveling. This is a tree that's been infected during the bloom, and the bloom is dying rather quickly. It's desiccating. So what are some of the laurel wilt ambrosia beetle control strategies? First one is healthy trees. So ambrosia beetles are not well attracted or not. If you have a healthy tree, it doesn't attract the ambrosia beetles like an unhealthy tree. So part of the strategy has been to detect the presence of infected trees and be aware of them as quickly as possible. In some cases, to try to suppress the ambrosia beetle population or their movement. Limit the laurel wilt root transmission. That's been very, very difficult. And then removing infested trees. That's being done and has been done. And then rehabilitating or replanting a grove that's been affected by the pathogen and the beetles. So here's the recommendations, and then here is the current situation. And so we recommend, promote tree health, take care of the trees. Healthy trees are not as well attracted to the beetles. Beetles are not as well attracted to healthy trees as unhealthy trees, right? Another thing that we have found that's very important to reduce and suppress the beetle activity is that you want to have, especially in old trees and old groves, is to have a pruning program. If you increase the light penetration and the wind movement inside a grove, you suppress the beetle activity and the beetle population. We do have a fungicide prophylactic treatment. In other words, it has to be systemically in the tree prior to it being infected. It's a material called propiconazole, or Tilt is the brand name. It is legal to use. You need to inject it or infuse it into the tree. I'd say, perhaps 17% of the industry has used this product. Some of the issues with it is that you have to do it every 12 to 18 months. You have to reapply. Once you stop applying, the tree, it doesn't kill the pathogen. It just suppresses the activity of the pathogen, the growth of the pathogen. So if you stop using the material, the pathogen can come back and end up killing the tree. The other thing too is another method for suppressing the ambrosia beetle is a biological control called Botanigard. And this is still being done on a small scale periodically to try to suppress that beetle population. We generally find the beetle population increases during the late winter, early spring, and then declines during the hotter part of the year. Okay, some other mitigation. Pruning the groves, as I mentioned, and this has been implemented on a large scale. So most people are using this and it's helping. The other is rehabilitating groves. So you have a grove where you have 100 trees per acre and 30 to 50 of them get killed by the beetle. So if it's economic, go in, remove those trees that are dead or declining, and replant those trees to get the grove back into production. And that's being done. And then replanting, and that's part of this rehabilitation. And we find that it varies on what percentage of the trees are being replanted that are killed. And there has been some grant money provided the avocado growers to help them either remove trees or to replant. It's sort of a cost sharing program. The other thing too is that in some cases, as I mentioned, because of the light and the wind movement in groves, we have found that in groves where people come in to top work the trees from one variety to another, that they are not getting attacked by the ambrosia beetle like groves where people have allowed the trees to get very large and it forms sort of like a forested canopy. So this might be an opportunity to change from varieties by top working. And this is being implemented where the growers feel it's economic. And the same thing with rejuvenating old forest-like trees. So you've got, trees that you've let go 25 feet, 30 feet, bringing the trees down to, 4 or 5 feet and basically rejuvenating, restarting the grove over. You see much less laurel wilt than in groves where people have let the trees stay like a forest. And so that's being implemented where it's economic as well. So current mitigation strategies that are ongoing is replanting avocado trees that are lost, and that's what you're seeing here and here. And I already mentioned, and the reason is because these young trees will not be root grafted among themselves for quite a while. We're not sure when. I would suspect 20 plus years. Also, the young trees are not as attractive to the ambrosia beetles, partly because of the high light regime, but also because of their small diameter. Anthracnose. This can be a problem on some varieties. I've already talked about Phytophthora. This is under wet or flooded conditions or soil saturated conditions. Scab varies by the variety. This can be controlled with fungicides, but it's better to use a variety that doesn't have a scab problem. Sun blotch is actually a viroid. And this, you just have to be very careful that you are not using propagation material that is infected with this sun blotch viroid. We don't see much of it around. It does occur occasionally, but you want to be on the lookout for it. If a tree has it, fruit looking like that, you need to destroy that tree. Why? Because it can move, the viroid can move through the root system to adjacent trees, but also can move through pollen to adjacent trees. So you really want to get rid of those trees if you happen to see it. It's, as I mentioned, we don't have a big problem with it here. in Florida, thank goodness, but you do see it occasionally. Lace bugs can be a problem during the fall when you want the tree to be accumulating carbohydrates. They'll colonize the leaves and it weakens the tree. Also, thrips can sometimes be a problem between fruits. Sometimes Lepidoptera can be a problem with leaves and actually attack the fruit. Only occasionally. They're not like constant problems. And so I will leave it there. Questions and
Thank you, Dr. Crane. So guys, I do want to ask you to do a very quick survey, 2 to 3 minutes. It's our big ask. And I'm going to put the link in the chat. Very quick. I think it's about 5 questions. So if you could do that, and then we're going to jump to the Q&A. So just click on the link, answer a few questions, and then we'll do the Q&A. I have a few sort of questions, sort of statements from Niraj, so we'll get to that. He just dominated the chat, Niraj. He was just so strong in the chat. Good job. So if you guys could just click on that, that'll be great. I can see how many people have done it. Right now we're at 17. So if we get it up to 30, we'll be good. I can't see it. I'm joking.
it's oh. I would encourage you to do the survey. It helps us out to know if not only to get a feel for what's going on with you and with the potential for avocados or the risks and but also whether the program is meeting your needs as well.
Yeah, like learning gains, and we do look at it and see what you say negative. We look at that more than the positive because we do want to get better each time. So I think you've probably done it by now. I'll put it in there one more time just in case. And then I'm going to read a few statements / questions. And then if you guys have more questions, feel free to put them in the chat. Let's see. So Niraj and Frederick both say they in the Tampa area, they want to grow avocados in the Lithia area. So not really a question, but
Okay. So a couple of things. One is you need to delve into all the weather or climate data you can for that area. So I would see if there are any University of Florida fawn weather sites nearby because it'll have some historical weather, especially for the past 10, 15 years that you can look at, and especially be looking at cold or freeze occurrences and freezing depth, how cold it's gotten and how often it's gotten cold. There's also the Southeast Regional Climate Data Center is another source of information. Agroclimate, one word, agroclimate is another website you're going to want to review for weather data. I would also look at the National Weather Service. I would also contact the Farm Bureau and the USDA Farm Service Agency and speak to them about the weather conditions, the potential for flooding, the soil types, but also the occurrence of freezes, what types of crops are grown in the areas that you're interested in planting avocados. And then, of course, you need to visit the sites. You need to look at the soils. I would encourage you to find out what are the soil types that you're looking at. Are there beds? Does it need to have beds? Is there mitigation already to prevent flooding? Does it have the pumps? Do you have access to water? That's important. So in Florida, you have to have a permit to draw water from a well or from a water body. And so you need to find out, how do you get your water, your permit for water, for pulling water? in that one of the fact sheets I have is how to establish a tropical fruit grove. I talk about all these different things that you need to know before you, or at least I would want to know before I purchased a piece of property, so that you are sure you have access to water, good quality water, that the soil is well drained, or that you can make the infrastructure such as beds, canals, ditches, pumps, all of those types of things before you purchase the property, or if you already have purchased the property, what could be done or what needs to be done. Um, so again, I would also, when you're out there looking, are there any other avocado trees out in that area? Are there any other avocado groves? Um, and how are they doing? So, you need to look at the plants that are out there, the soil, and as much climate information. Like I said, talk to the Farm Service Agency, talk to people at the Farm Bureau. Farm Bureau will be farmers, um, and get a feel for, what has been the recent climate. I'm talking about, what has been the climate in the past 10 years? Have they had freezing events in the past 2 or 3 years, 5 years? How often and how cold did it get? I should stop there. Sorry.
Thank you, Jonathan. Niraj also asks, super easy question. Which cultivar is recommended for Florida? And then do we need to have a mix of A and B?
Yeah. So it's really hard to tell you what cultivar. It depends on the market you're trying to address. So are you trying to target the Haas-like or Haas market, or are you tending more towards the tropical avocados, or are you trying to address a super niche where you're going to grow some of the avocados that the peel turns maroon or dark maroon? So there's a lot to consider in selecting the cultivar. Also, their cold tolerance. You're right about that. So I would take a look at those slides and think about that. As I mentioned, you have to think about, what market are you targeting, and do you have a market, or is it something you're going to try to create a niche market? Um, so it's a little hard for me to tell you, grow this, grow that. I would say that in general, you do want to have A and B type avocados, um, so that you have that potential for cross-pollination. As I mentioned before, in general, cross-pollinated fruit set better than self-pollinated fruit. It's not 100%. I mean, there's solid groves of a number of different varieties which do fine, but in general, cross-pollination is a good thing.
Thank you, Jonathan. I've got a few questions on pruning. And Christine says, do you recommend tipping young avocado trees similar to mango? I told her that they do kind of break on their own and then I do tip them a little. So maybe get your
Yeah.
idea as well.
Yeah, I mean, Jeff, it's not going to hurt. Let me put it
Yeah.
that way. It's not going to hurt.
Okay.
It's a different tree than mango, but
Yeah.
it's not going to hurt. Yeah.
Yeah. I tip them a little, not a lot though. And I take out the strong verticals when they're young.
I, I do the
Yeah.
same thing.
Yeah. Muriel asks, is there a chart video on how to prune an avocado tree?
So you're talking about hand pruning an individual avocado tree. I don't think we've done a video of hand pruning individual avocado trees. I mean, it's something that could be done. It would mostly relate to avocado trees in the home landscape. Um, yeah, so I mean, I know I do have some photographs of avocado trees in the home landscape before and after a pruning. Um,
Yeah, I
but
have some.
yeah, I don't have a video of it. That's something
I,
we should consider. Yeah.
I do have a Tropical Fruit Tuesday on pruning in general. So you could check that out because it just gives the concepts which you could apply.
Do you want to put the link to that in your chat?
Sure, I'll do that in a moment.
Okay.
Let me get, or you want to take over the questions? Can you see them?
I haven't looked. This is
Okay,
in the chat. This is in the chat.
yeah, because I can't do more than two things at once. It's impossible.
I'm lucky if I can do one. Let me just see there. Let me see if I can. Excuse me. They're probably at the bottom, right? Let's see. Which question are you at, Jeff? Oh, best prune avocado. Okay. Tipping. This is recorded. Yeah, this will be this presentation has been recorded and will be online shortly. Somebody living in South Florida, I'm more concerned about the higher temperatures and drought than freeze. Is there a drought study about avocado varieties? I'm not aware. I mean, drought has been studied in avocados, yes. And off the top of my head, I can't remember that there's any like significant differences in drought tolerance. There may be between the cultivars, but the main thing is that you're going to want to be able to irrigate the trees, whether that's commercially or in the home landscape. You want to make provision for being able to irrigate the trees during high temperature periods and during dry periods, so that you can avoid the drought stress. I mean, that's basically the theme. But I'm trying to think, Jeff, I don't know if you have any feel for that. I don't remember distinctly reading. I'd have to go back and see that, but I would suspect there probably are some differences, but nothing that like stands out dramatically about differences in the cultivars.
No.
Let me see. Buyers place a lot of importance on avocados with high fat and oil content. There is work being done on creating cultivars that grow well in Florida that are higher in fat content. Is there? Yeah, so um, as I mentioned, one of our plant breeders, Dr. Shapiro, is looking at high quality avocado varieties with a main emphasis not only on high quality avocado, but on cold tolerance as well. That would be, that's something for the future, but it is being worked on. That takes, quite a bit of time to get, to get to. One thing I would tell you is that there is this idea that the oil content correlates with with good quality or good tasting avocados, and it's actually much more complex than that. So I'll give you an example. Um, Choquette avocados, Monroe avocados. These are large. They're considered, tropical avocado. They are of excellent quality, but they do not have nearly the oil content that things like Hass or the Hass-like avocados have. So it's a much more complex thing than just having oil, higher fat and oil content on whether the avocado tastes well. I guess you can make a general statement that it is true, but it's not entirely true.
I can read for you now, Jonathan, if you want.
Okay, sure.
Bill asked, in Polk County, you said there's over 100 acres being grown. Do you know what varieties these are? Second question, how do we source trees for trial? So I guess
Yeah.
how does he get trees?
Um, Actually, I don't know, Jeff, if you have the handout
Yeah, I'll throw that in there.
on nurseries. So there are nurseries throughout Florida that do produce avocado trees. So there are some sources of avocado trees. Um, yeah. So the varieties they're growing, let me let me look at you see, I'm gonna have to get out of this to do this. Let me stop sharing.
So in the chat, I put the tropical fruit Tuesday on pruning. And then also I just put the link of where to buy fruit trees. It's probably about 15, 20 spots there. Most of them are down here, of course, this tropical fruit trees, but
Let
some
me
are a
see if
little further north.
I find the, pretty sure I have. My notes on what this person is growing. Sorry, take me a
No
moment
problem.
to get there.
I'll answer Muriel's question. I think I can do this one. Muriel asked, can Florida green avocados be grafted with any specific cultivar? Yeah, they can be grafted on different cultivars of avocados. And when you say cultivar, that means it already has a name. So I guess, you know, if you had a Monroe, you could graft a Simmons into it, but typically you're growing into a seedling avocado. So you just have a seedling and then you put the Monroe right on that. You can pretty much put an avocado on an avocado. So you're okay there, Muriel. And then she also asked, you talked about ultra density for avocados. Can you elaborate? That just means you're tightly packing your trees together, much tighter than normal. And the way to get away with that is you're going to do a lot of pruning, or you have trees that don't grow as much as our trees here. So you would see that more in California and Mexico, where the trees are a little not so vigorous, and they kind of grow more up than out.
Yeah, and so to play off on and to add to what Jeff is talking about, so there are some varieties that are less vigorous, and I guess some people call them more dwarf than others. Um, so an example is reed avocado. Um, and it is grown in California and grown in some other areas at high density. Um, and so the tree, can be pruned and manipulated and still be productive. And that's not true of all cultivars. If you have to do constant pruning, that can sometimes just lead to more shoots and more leaves. Two things about that as well is that in some of these high density plantings, there is a plant growth regulator. It's an auxin that is used during the pruning program. And these trees are pruned by hand. They're kept at about 7 feet or less, and they're kept at about 9 to 10 feet apart, like a cylinder. But it is an intensive pruning program where they're doing selective pruning, rejuvenation pruning, and they're using this plant growth regulator to restrict the amount of new vegetative growth that occurs because of the pruning. The other thing that is in their favor is that this is being done in subtropical, or actually cool subtropical areas, or Mediterranean area climate like areas that are cool. So the trees are less vigorous just because it is cool temperatures in those areas. So in warmer areas such as Florida, it's much harder to restrict a tree's vegetative growth. And so whether we could do a high density avocado planting with or without the plant growth regulator would remain to be seen, because it is an intensive pruning and management program, but it's being done in cooler areas. So, not so sure that that would work in Florida.
Gina asks, what are your thoughts on growing Oro Negro, Monroe, or Simmons in Central Florida?
Yeah. So Monroe, in fact, somebody was asking me about the varieties that this planting is in Polk County. They're growing Haas, they're growing Monroe. I think they have some Choquettes. So yeah, so Monroe is a good one. I wouldn't do Simmons in Central Florida. Simmons is a West Indian ecotype, much more susceptible to cold and freezing temperatures. So the Monroe would be fine, Choquette would be fine. You can go back to the slides and you can see our list there of some of the varieties that you might want to try.
Quinette asks, any guidance on determining the difference between salt damage versus root rot? The pictures look similar.
Mm. Yeah, so in general, the root rot, couple of things. One is because the root rot is affecting the root system, you're going to see a drought stress like symptoms, which could be on new growth, wilting, new stems and leaves would be wilting. On the older growth, you would see this, leaf yellowing because the tree is not taking up nutrients. Um, Whereas with the salinity stress or the salt stress, more than likely you're going to see browning of the tips of the leaves and the margins of the leaves. Um, and that would be like a major difference. The other thing you want to think about is, have you had a flooding event or have you had, yeah, a flooding event, and whether you've had storm surge or, salinity intrude into the aquifer or your wells. So you need to think about what has happened in the past, week, months, whatever. Um, I don't know if that answers your question.
Thank you, Jonathan. So that is looking like you got all the questions. So if anybody has one last question before we shut it down, and remember, this is being recorded. So very quickly, it'll be up on YouTube and you're going to search New Growers Workshop Avocado and you should hit it. One question from Frederick. If you had a smaller farm, 1 to 2 acres, would you recommend grafting A-type to B avocado? Could that help production? I would consider doing this when the trees are small.
In other words, putting some B branches on an A-type tree.
Is that what
Uh,
you're asking, Frederick, to add some branches that are? Yeah, he says yes.
yeah, I mean, you can certainly do that. Where that get two complications. One is sometimes one of the varieties is a more vigorous plant than the other, and you can end up where they're competing. And let's say it's the B one is the more vigorous one. It ends up overtaking the A type, or it's much harder to control the B type. So it becomes a pruning management issue. The other thing too is that when it comes to harvesting, you got to be sure that you're picking the A or the B that's ready, because they may not be ready to be harvested at the same time. So you got to keep track of that. But it is, I mean, in fact, commercially in some production areas, people will do just what you're talking about. They'll have an orchard or a grove, and they'll take one tree out of like every 9 trees, one tree out of every 9 trees, and they'll graft. Let's say it's a grove with all A type variety. They'll graft a limb of a B on every 9th tree to have it for pollination purposes. And you know, like I said, it can complicate things, but if the fruit are definitely so different from each other, it may not be a problem. Ideally, both the A and the B would be commercially saleable. That would be the ideal. But again, you'd have to keep them, the idea would keep track of it is what I'm trying to say. But yeah, that actually, or in some cases, what people will do is every 9th tree will be the complementary variety. So you have a grove of A's, and you have every 9th tree, not every ninth, well, yeah, in a pattern, every 9th tree or so will be the B tree. It's actually the whole tree is a B. And the research has shown that if you have A and B type varieties next to each other, let's say this is a grove over here of all A's, this is a grove over here of all B's, they find that the effect of the cross pollination is highest in the trees of the A and B trees that are near each other, and that the effect gets less and less as the rows of A's and the rows of B's occur, but it's hundreds, it's hundreds of feet. But yeah, so that's another way to do it. Commercially, sometimes people will plant 2, 3, 4, 5 rows, maybe 10 rows of an A, and then 2, 3, 4, 5 rows of a B, or 1 row of B, 5 of A, 5